All right, welcome to the February-March Greysteel Research Review. Welcome aboard, and I'm Jonathon Sullivan. I'm the owner and operator of Greysteel Strength and Conditioning in Farmington Hills, Michigan. And I'm joined for this particular installment by my good friend and colleague, Dr. John Petrizzo. John is an associate professor in the exercise science program at Adelphi University. He's currently the chair of the Starting Strength Coaches Association Science Committee. He's a starting strength coach. He's the author of a number of peer-reviewed publications in the exercise science literature. And his current focus is the use of resistance training in older adults with cognitive impairment, which I just think is way cool. Tell us a little bit about that, John.
Sure. So we're working in conjunction with some researchers from local hospital system, Northwell Health, Jeremy Koppel, who's a physician, a psychiatrist, and is married to fellow starting strength coach Ina Koppel, kind of got us involved in
they're both deep into this topic. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So essentially what we've been doing since we started in August of 2017 with our data collection after we did our pilot testing, we are putting older adults who have mild cognitive impairment through a 6-month resistance training protocol. And we are doing monthly functional assessments. We're using the short form of physical performance battery. We are taking biologic samples monthly, and we're doing cognitive testing pre and post at the end of the intervention. So we should be finishing up our data collection within the next 2 months or so. We've gotten about 30 or so subjects through the 6-month protocol, and I'm looking forward to seeing the results. From my standpoint, we've seen a big improvement from a functional standpoint. These people have gotten stronger. They become more physically capable. We haven't done anything to their nutrition, and the ones that have been frail have gained body weight. The ones that are obese have lost body weight. We see people going from being in wheelchairs to being able to use a walker, from using a walker to not needing an assistive device. So from a functional standpoint, it's been great, but our primary objective is to hopefully see if it's had any influence on their cognitive function. So that remains to be seen.
That's so cool. So I'm looking forward to presenting that paper in Journal Club. And I know it'll be awesome, and it's such important work. And I'm just so gratified that somebody's looking at that the right way. All right, John, you ready to get going?
I'm ready.
All right. So we got a lot of work to do. So let's hop to it. Mm-hmm. We're going to get things going here. So the first one actually is yours. It's an in-depth look at Androulakis. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so this is an interesting article. It caught my attention because of the title. So the minimum effective training dose required to increase 1RM strength in resistance trained men. And this is a systematic review and meta-analysis. So my background, the exercise science program that I teach in, one of my colleagues has actually done some of the most heavily cited work in regards to one set to failure training and the benefits of that. And so right away I was kind of interested to see what this paper had to say. Overall, I think they had some interesting findings, but let's start by talking about the introduction, okay?
Sure.
So I thought that the introduction did a good job of talking about how really the literature has shown that there's a variety of different ways that you can improve 1RM strength, right? And that's something that we know. These studies are often very short in nature. They have small sample sizes, and they usually use relatively untrained individuals. So you get a positive result almost no matter what you do. So I thought that they were upfront about that. They talked about the concept of a minimum effective dose and the dose-response relationship, which has become kind of a hot topic in the literature over the last couple of years. And
properly so.
Right.
So. Yeah.
Right. And they also referred to what we kind of in the starting strength community refer to as the novice effect. So they acknowledge that untrained individuals are going to respond positively to just about any resistance training protocol. And essentially they closed by saying that the purpose of the article was to systematically review the available evidence regarding the minimum effective training dose required to increase 1RM strength in resistance trained men. So they're specifically trying to find what's the least amount that a trained male could do and still make progress in terms of their 1RM strength.
Good. And?
So in regards to their inclusion criteria, obviously peer-reviewed articles published in English, full text. They did not put any limitations on their publishing year. As far as some of the more important things from a nitty-gritty standpoint for us, the resistance training intervention had to last a minimum of 4 weeks, a maximum of 1 working set per exercise per training session. Which
I thought was weird.
Yeah.
But anyway, go ahead.
Healthy men with at least 1 year of resistance training experience and at least one of the power lifts included, so referring to the squat, bench press, or deadlift. And the studies that they included had to use a 1RM to assess for changes in strength.
So pretty good stuff there. Yeah.
Yeah. So what they ultimately boiled that down to from an initial over 2,000 articles in their search was 6 studies that they ultimately included. And then they did retrospectively a meta-analysis to assess for the changes in 1RM strength in the lowest dose group in each of the included studies. So the group that did the least. And as far as the results, so all the studies included in the analysis reported significant increase in strength in their lowest volume group. And I just have some of that kind of broken down here. So there was a study that they included by Ostrowski, that saw a 10 kilogram increase in squat and about 3.5 kilogram in bench press 1RM from performing a single set per week in each lift. An article that they included by Schoenfeld reported a 19 kilogram increase in the squat and about a 9 kilogram increase in bench press 1RM, performing a single set in each training session. Another study by Kramer had about a 12 kilogram increase in the squat 1RM, and that was from performing a single set 2 times per week. Another study by Marshall had about a 16.5 kilogram increase in squat 1RM, and that was from a single set twice per week. And finally, 2 other studies had about a 12 kilogram increase in bench press 1RM for groups performing a single set just 3 times a week. So one of the things that I kind of gathered from all the studies and looking at the final numbers was that after the training intervention, so minimum 4-week training intervention, the 1RMs on average were about 300 pounds in the squat and about 200 pounds in the bench press. So, certainly trained, but I don't know if that's what we would really call a advanced lifter or someone that's highly trained at that point.
Not when you're talking about 20, 30-year-olds or even maybe early 40s. I don't think that's particularly impressive, but still greater than the general public.
Yes, right, of course. So in regards to the meta-analysis, they included 5 studies. They had a total of 55 participants from the lowest dose groups, and they concluded that they had about a 17.5 kilogram increase in their squat and about an 8 kilogram increase in their bench press. And the authors
couldn't really say anything about deadlift.
No,
right?
So there just wasn't enough data on the deadlift that they can include it in the study. So, so what they concluded was that they're basically a single set of 6 to 12 repetitions with loads ranging from 70 to 85% of 1RM, 2 to 3 times a week with a high intensity of effort. So most of these studies used either muscular failure or what they term volitional failure, which basically means what? Means stop whenever you want. You know?
Exactly. It's very scientific.
Right. But so kind of a side note on that is, for years, we've been using muscular failure as this kind of something that you should strive for to ensure that you're making progress. And a lot of the studies now are using volitional failure and showing that you get good results with that also. So, so 8 to 12 for 8 to 12 weeks can produce suboptimal yet significant increases in squat and bench press 1RM strength in resistance trained men. And they also said that there's a lack of research pertaining to deadlift 1RM strength, women and strength athletes. So they didn't really have any competitive lifters in any of their cohorts. So
exactly what we talked about last year in August at SSCA. You know, the people who really need the research on like fine tuning the program of an elite athlete, those people are not
right.
going to participate in your crazy study. And
Yeah.
so we just don't know much about those people.
Yeah, it's hard to recruit. First, I mean, even though these sports have grown in popularity, it's hard to get a decent sample size. One of the studies that I did was with competitive Olympic weightlifters, and over the course of about 2 years, I had 10 lifters in my study. So it's certainly a challenge. You know, the way that I kind of looked at it, now they kept using the term suboptimal, but to me, if you look at the improvements that were made, you know, a 17.5 kilogram increase on the squat and an 8 kilogram increase on the bench press, I think that most trained lifters would take that improvement.
I'd take that in a heartbeat.
Right. So
I'd love that.
So to me, you know, they keep using the term suboptimal. I don't think that their data really showed that. You know, they kept kind of comparing to other studies that have been done. And I think that basically what you can take from this is that someone who's moderately trained can still make progress in terms of their strength on a pretty low volume training program for a relatively short period of time, assuming that they're lifting moderately heavy loads with a high level of effort and in a progressive manner, you know. And I think that that's good news for people, because the biggest constraint that your average, you know, fitness enthusiast, right, has is that they say they don't have time, right? And if we, you know, if we can get a lot of bang for our buck with our training and get our clients good progress on a relatively low volume, time consuming program, I think that that's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. I feel pretty much the same way about it. I don't know where this suboptimal thing that they're talking about. I don't think the gains were suboptimal. What it suggests to me is that their training up to that point had been suboptimal, and they had room to grow. And when they got into something that they had to do a program, even though it wasn't like a really aggressive program, that they saw some gains.
Yeah.
So,
and if you look at, I mean, most people that say they've been training, right? So you get a group of college students, let's say, that, they've been lifting weights for a year, like this study said. I think they ended up saying on average, when they looked at their studies, the average training age was about 2 years for their cohort. But, you know,
they weren't really training.
Most people are not training, right?
Exactly.
They're not really following a program. They're going to the gym, they're lifting some weights, and they're messing around.
They're thrashing about. That's exactly right.
Right. So now when you actually put them on a structured program for a period of time, even if it's a low volume program like the ones that they looked at, they still made really good progress. So again, I think that it's a good thing in general.
Yeah, I like this paper. I think it has, you know, a practical message for us.
Mm-hmm.
Right up front in the discussion, we saw this acknowledgement that there's more than one way to skin a cat.
Right.
And both training the heavy loads without failure and training to failure with lighter loads, you know, it can help maintain or increase strength. And I think that's one of the underlying themes of this particular installment of Research Review, the papers that we're going to look at today.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you look at the fitness community, particularly the online fitness community, you find brand loyalty and religious fervor. But when you actually read the people who make a living researching this stuff, you find a lot more dispassionate view and a lot less certainty, and that's important. I think anybody who's interested in training science or coaching should pull this paper and take a look at the table of the included papers, which drive these points home, and read the discussion, which is a nice overview of where things stand. As to the actual results, I think it's probably right. It's totally in line with our experience, and you know, it's not news, but I think it supports the idea that we can eke out small gains, or at least maintain gains, by just going moderately heavy-ish once or twice or 3 times a week, which can help coaches and trainees, you know, get through the rough patches of life.
Yeah, maintain compliance, right? I mean, that's what it's all about, is being consistent with your training as much as anything else.
And it gets this whole concept of the minimum effective dose out there a little bit more. So, you know, it's not earth-shattering, but I think it belongs in our database, and I think it makes some really good points. So
I agree.
Nice work on that. All right. So let's see. Next one is this one's also yours. It's a quick look at Kryzyzstofic There's somewhere from the stands or something.
So this article, I'll let you stick with the author, but maximizing muscle hypertrophy. So again, a systematic review of advanced resistance training techniques and methods. And this was published in 2019, so it's a new study. And this is going to be a brief one because I don't know how you felt about it, but it basically says that all of these various techniques that they were looking at, and really this paper is more about hypertrophy training than strength training.
Right.
There's just not a lot of information about these advanced techniques, as the author kind of states. So they come out initially during the introduction and state that there's a lack of consensus regarding the efficacy of advanced resistance training techniques and methods in comparison to traditional approaches. So they search for articles that utilize the following techniques: tempo eccentric technique, accentuated eccentric loading method, low load resistance under blood flow restriction, cluster sets technique, supersets and pre-exhaustion technique, drop sets, and sarcoplasma stimulating technique. So essentially, the authors concluded that there's insufficient evidence to provide specific guidelines for volume, intensity of effort, and frequency of the advanced techniques and methods mentioned above. So essentially, they have no idea how to utilize these things, right? And to me, there's just, what does this say? There's not a lot of high quality evidence to support these so-called advanced techniques. And while some trainees may get benefit from them because it breaks up the monotony of their training and that sort of thing, I think that the majority of people would be better served sticking to kind of your meat and potatoes in terms of your programming, right? The stuff that we preach all the time. And these things sometimes I think can become a distraction to productive training as much as they could possibly be a benefit. And at this point, there's just really not any evidence that we can point to say this is how you effectively utilize, some of these advanced techniques. So.
Yeah, I think this paper has value because it's important to know what you don't know. Again, I agree with your assessment. I think this paper is really, though, required reading for anybody who's interested in resistance training for a few reasons. First of all, the bibliography is goldmine, and there are notes all through my copy where I've reminded myself to pull a cited paper. Second, the introduction discussion are an excellent review of where we're at on this topic and the work that's been done to date and the available options, as you pointed out, that have been employed and investigated for muscle hypertrophy. And we also get a bit of the biology, the holy trinity of muscle, mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage.
Right. Yeah, I thought they did a really nice job discussing that aspect of hypertrophy training.
Right. So the didactic parts of the manuscript are valuable.
Right.
The absolute requirement for a net positive nitrogen balance and the fractional muscle protein synthesis has to exceed the muscle protein breakdown for hypertrophy to occur. And this paper gives us a pretty good assessment of where we're at, which is a literature in equipoise. We just don't know.
Right.
And the evidence is not dispositive for clear superiority of any approach. When you look at the summary of these 30 articles in the table, including the results, you see the problem right away. The data is all over the place.
That's right.
Tempo is important. Tempo is not so important. Accentuated eccentric loading method is effective, and it isn't effective. One group says blood flow restriction is the juice, and the other, not so much. Cluster sets are groovy, cluster sets are lame. Supersets seem to be a little more robust data-wise than the other techniques, but not enough for me to use them to any considerable degree in my practice. All this stuff. And, if you're a proponent of this high load training, you're going to find data that you can get hypertrophy from that comparable to low load using lower volumes. If you're a low intensity guru, you're going to find papers saying you can get hypertrophy from that, although you need higher volumes and probably volitional failure to get there. But one thing you won't be able to say, based on all of this available data, no matter which camp you're in, is that your way is right and the other ways are wrong because that data is simply not there.
Exactly.
And finally, I think this paper gives us an opportunity to remind people that while advanced trainees may need advanced techniques to advance muscle hypertrophy, for novices and intermediates, we don't need all these Baroque elaborate interventions. You know, if we're getting stronger past the raw novice phase, we're doing it in part by adding muscle. You know, we may not be doing it in the Schwarzenegger range, but in the masters population, that kind of cosmetic bulking is not the primary training goal. So if people get to be advanced intermediates or competitive bodybuilders and they want to get swole, you know, they want to experiment with these techniques and see which ones work best for them, you know. So it's like with a lot of things, all these approaches are more faith-based than evidence-based, and which technique you follow probably has more to do with which fitness or bodybuilding celebrity you follow more than which data you look at, you know.
Yeah.
So,
and I think you raise a good point. I mean, depending on your particular perspective on any of these topics, you could basically find research that supports your point of view, you know? So,
exactly.
And the other thing is, and this is something we see throughout the literatures, but there is no standardization of protocols for any of these things. And that's what makes it so hard to do a good systematic review or meta-analysis, is that there's just so many different methodologies that are used in these different studies. So it's really hard to pull it all together.
It'd be like if in the physics community, people couldn't agree on what an electron was.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
It's just crazy. So, you know, all this quasi-religious Sturm and Drang and fanboy posturing and armchair coach trolling and, you know, surrounding the so-called debate is just completely inappropriate and silly. Bottom line, we got lots of heat and little light. There's no one true holy swoly religion, and there's more than one way to hypertrophy heaven. So, but it has degenerated into a religious debate. That's the problem,
right?
And you know, this is unlikely to shut up the trolls, but there it is. Okay, so anything else to say about that one?
No, I think we kind of covered it.
Okay, next one is mine. It's Grandou et al. Overtraining and resistance exercise, and exploratory systematic review and methodological appraisal of the literature from the Human Performance Research Center in Sydney, Australia. Published in Sports Medicine, December 19th. So again, very recent. And I think a very important review. But again, more for what it tells us about what we don't know than about what we do. So it's a pretty well done systematic review of the available literature on the entire spectrum of overreaching, non-functional overreaching, and overtraining. So to review, functional overreaching is basically a sort of progressive overload that leads to a performance improvement, whereas non-functional overreaching results in decrements in performance that can last weeks to months. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I was gonna say these definitions are somewhat ambiguous to a certain degree, but they did a good job in trying to define them in this study.
They tried to nail it down as much as they could. Can we sort of agree on what an electron is? And then overtraining syndrome is, you know, the extreme end of the spectrum, corresponding loosely to exhaustion in the Cellier model. Loosely, where performance is trashed for months or even years, and you can wreck an entire career.
Right. So essentially, the only difference between non-functional overreaching and overtraining is the time that it takes to recover from the decreased performance.
Yeah, and that's the point that they make.
Right.
So as you say, you know, that's the critical thing. All these stops on the overtraining spectrum, on this spectrum, which goes from functional to, you know, pathological, are determined by performance. And the differentiation between them is, as you point out, a temporal one. The longer the performance decrement lasts, the further along the spectrum you are towards overtraining syndrome. So even normal training results in a short-term decrement. You're always weaker when you leave the gym than when you got there. But the key factor is this performance decrement, which I emphasize is the only established and generally agreed upon diagnostic criterion for non-functional overreaching or OTS. So there's a lot of literature out there about using other diagnostic criteria. And, you know, the holy grail is to be able to monitor some objective biomarker to alert you to incipient overtraining so that you can change course before you wreck your athlete. But this review illustrates, I think, really nicely that while we have candidate biomarkers, we just don't have the evidence to back them up for even retrospective diagnosis, much less for evaluating risk during training. I don't think I need to go into the details of how the review is conducted. Those of you who are nerds could and should retrieve this paper, because as systematic reviews go, it was fairly well conducted. Suffice to say that out of 3,000 papers identified by their search criteria, only about a couple of dozen met criteria for review. And of these, only 14 were randomized controlled trials, and the rest were non-randomized or uncontrolled observations or trials. The major unifying theme here is that the vast majority of this literature failed to actually produce overtraining in the experimental subjects, which I think is just hilarious. In only about half of the selected papers was a single performance decrement observed. And in only 8 of those was their follow-up measures of performance. So we don't really even know if these subjects had non-functional overreaching or overtraining syndrome.
Right. So, and they actually did a good job of pointing that out, I think, throughout the article. Is that most of these protocols aren't even stressful enough to induce what they are trying to induce in regards to overtraining and
so not even can we agree on what an electron is. We can't even really agree whether we're studying one. Right. We can't even show that we're actually studying one. So the most common measure they used was a decline in maximum muscular strength, although as the authors point out, this may not be the best measure even for strength athletes. So what we have here is this body of literature on non-functional overreaching and overtraining, in which most of the time we can't even establish that any real pathology is present. In other words, this is exactly like if we had this vast body of data on asthma, right, in which most of the experimental subjects cannot be shown to actually have asthma, right? So you can't find out a lot about the system you're trying to study if you can't even verify that the system is actually present. So it's just remarkable. So trying to get from there to the establishment of clinically useful biomarkers like testosterone ratios or cortisol or muscle damage markers, heart rate variability, all these things is putting the cart before the horse a bit, I think.
Yeah. And one of the things that I thought was interesting in the article that they also point out is that a lot of what we've applied to resistance training in regards to overtraining literature is really taken from aerobic training. So
not even really relevant to that thing that we do.
Right. Exactly. Yep.
So, we do have some biomarker data, but it's mostly retrospective and non-discriminatory, by which I mean that the biomarkers were measured after a protocol that resulted in performance decrement. And biochemical markers have never been demonstrated, as far as I know, to be able to distinguish between functional overreaching, non-functional overreaching, and overtraining syndrome, assuming you could even agree on the definition.
Right, exactly.
So the authors, they point out these manifold methodological issues in this body of literature, and there's a big problem with misdiagnosis, and they make suggestions for future research. So you can find a big take-home at the end of the discussion where the authors say, and I quote, the lack of standardized diagnostic criteria and the inconsistency and variability in measurements of performance, biochemistry, physiology, and psychology amongst studies make it difficult
impossible
to establish the relationship between overtraining and resistance exercise, unquote. And then they go on to say the one really dumb thing in this paper when they go on to say, quote, athletes and coaches should regularly monitor a combination of performance, biochemical, physiological, and psychological variables to identify athletes that may be approaching training maladaptation, which I think is a total scream because they just spent the entire paper telling us that we don't know which of these variables to measure or how or when or under what parameters. So that's really kind of silly. I think overtraining syndrome is a clinical diagnosis. I think it's incumbent on the coach to have a high index of suspicion, and to in those athletes that are engaged in high intensity training and aggressive programs, meaning advanced and elite athletes and masters. And I think coaches should err on the side of instituting corrective recovery measures when athletes begin to display unexpected performance decrements. And it would be nice to have these, prospective biomarkers. And I think there are several good candidates out there right now, but the truth is, we just don't know their diagnostic power, their receiver operator characteristics, sensitivity, specificity, negative predictive value. We don't know any of those things because in most of the available literature, we just don't even know if we're actually looking at the disease that they're supposed to diagnose or predict. So, it's a mess. It's a mess.
No, I agree. I think that the one way that you can kind of look at this is almost that it's probably harder to induce overtraining than maybe a lot of coaches would say. You almost have to.
That's a good point.
You almost have to ignore, some of the warning signs to get to that point. And like you said, if you're really working with people, high level athletes are always going to be pushing themselves, maybe on closer to that edge, and certainly masters athletes, are going to be much more sensitive. But for a lot of people, you really have to ignore, what your body is telling you to get to that point where you're really seeing prolonged performance loss, like they talk about in terms of overtraining. When they're talking about months and months of recovery required, I mean, how hard do you have to push to get to that point? And the literature to this point wouldn't even say that they've been able to really do that effectively. So
in Gem Pop non-masters,
right.
I think it's probably extraordinary.
Right.
However, again, this goes back to what I said in August, which is where I think exercise physiology needs to be, especially with regards to resistance training and programming, is, basically it's like you're studying gorillas. So go and, there are in fact world-class strength athletes. Mm-hmm. Instead of like trying to pull them into your lab to do some weird shit on them, it's like, hey, we want to overtrain you. Like, yeah, that's going to happen, right? Why don't you instead
go observe them in the wild.
In the wild, and see what's happening to them. And some of them will be overtrained. Like if you spend all your time watching a Kendrick Ferris or a Klokov or something, eventually you're going to see one of those guys get overtrained because those guys are on the red line all the time.
Right.
On the other hand, they didn't get where they are by being dumb, so maybe not as much as you like. So this is going to be an elusive diagnostic dilemma. But for most general population athletes, it's probably a little bit irrelevant. I think that what you see in masters and younger general population athletes is not so much overtraining syndrome. What you see is they drop out.
Right.
Or they get injured, they get tweaked, right? Or something like that. Maybe they get a little bit sick, but you're not going to take a general population athlete with, your basic heavy, light, medium program and crush them and get them into a true overtraining syndrome where it takes them months or years to recover.
Right.
But
exactly.
But in elite athletes, the only way you're going to see this is if you go into the wild and observe the gorillas, and nobody does that.
Right.
So anything else on this one?
No, I mean, I found the paper to be fascinating in terms of just the total lack of information that we have on this topic. Because it's something that if you pick up any human kinetics textbook, anything from the NSCA, what do they talk about in there? Overtraining, as if it's just a matter of fact that this is the way it goes.
It's endemic. It's endemic. It's a plague. It's just not.
And just the literature does not support that notion, and we're really a far ways away from being able to get to that point.
Yeah. In most athletes, that's absolutely the case.
Yeah.
All right. So that was a fun one.
Yeah.
All right. So the next one is yours. It's another deep dive. We're going to talk about Lacerda.
Yes.
I'm really happy to have this one here. So go ahead and introduce it for us.
So this is Lacerda et al. Is performing repetitions to failure less important than volume for muscle hypertrophy and strength? This is from the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research.
We're not going to get anything in the comments about this. Nobody's got an opinion on this.
And this is from December 2019. So it was published online in December. So another recent study. And, right away, with this, the first thing that I'll say is that this is a intra-individual experimental design. So essentially what they did here is they took untrained individuals and they had them perform a knee extension resistance training protocol unilaterally. So they had a different protocol for one extremity than they did for the other. And my immediate reaction whenever I see this type of protocol is, I cringe a little bit, because the way that I look at resistance training, the way that you look at resistance training, is that it is a systemic stress that we're applying to the body, but I have to say, I think that these guys did a really good job of putting together a pretty tight protocol
within that crazy model.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So they used
right.
They did a really good job of using a really shitty model.
Exactly.
That's
right.
how I feel about it.
No, I agree. So right away, I didn't want to like this paper, because as soon as I see that intra-individual design, I just say, like, when are these people going to get it?
And they even talk about it. They even it's like, yeah, we know this is screwy, but we did it anyway.
Exactly. And so but with that being said, I think that they did a good job within those parameters that they set for themselves for whatever reason. So, so in regards to the introduction, I thought that they did a good review of the literature comparing training to muscular failure versus not training to failure. And they note that many studies comparing the differing protocols do not equate intensity and volume. And that's one of the recurrent themes that we see throughout the literature, is that a lot of these, when you're comparing a protocol, if you don't equate volume, then you're often going to get, results that are a little bit screwy. So like we said, it's an intra-individual design. They had volunteers. They had a total of 10 participants. They performed unilateral knee extension training protocols for 14 weeks, which each of their lower extremities performing either to muscular failure or not. And they did pretty comprehensive pre and post measures. So that included maximal voluntary isometric contraction using an isokinetic dynamometer, 1RM testing, repetitions to failure, cross-sectional area of the quadriceps using ultrasound, and surface EMG of the quadriceps. So average age of the participants was about 23 years old. Their inclusion criteria, so they were men that were not performing any resistance training for the previous 6 months. No functional limitations that would impact their ability to carry out the 1RM testing. No use of any sort of performance-enhancing drugs or supplements, and no other resistance training performed throughout the protocol. So these are people that were not training previously and were not doing anything other than their knee extensions throughout the 14-week period.
Real-life scenario.
Yeah. So all subjects, they had 100% compliance, which is, I think, pretty unusual for these types of studies. And basically the protocol consisted of 3 to 4 sets. They started out at 50 to 60% of 1RM with 3 minutes rest in between the sets. 1RMs were assessed every 2 weeks in order to maintain relative intensity. So they were adjusting the percentage that they were working at accordingly. And the way that they equated the volume between the protocols, they took the total number of repetitions performed in the training, in the failure training from the previous session, and they divided that number into whatever number of sets that they were supposed to perform for the group for the lower extremity that was not training to failure. So as in regards to their results, they essentially found no statistically significant differences in any of the variables that they analyzed. So again, that's cross-sectional area, that's 1RM, that's maximal voluntary isometric contraction, EMG, and repetitions to fatigue. So there are lots of things that they looked at, and they didn't find a difference in any of them.
They proved the null hypothesis.
Yeah, exactly. Now it's kind of interesting in terms of their conclusions. They said that for untrained individuals, it's possible to suggest that an increased volume may be a more important variable than performing repetitions to muscular failure for the chronic adaptations associated with resistance training. And that's a quote directly from the paper. And I just don't see anything in the paper that really so their data supports that statement. I think that these guys kind of had an agenda to show that you don't have to train to failure, and they were kind of grasping at anything that
and when their data came in, it was a dark day for their bias, you know. Yeah. So yeah.
But then later on, they go on to say that this study showed that a no muscular failure training protocol with equal volumes as a muscular failure protocol produces similar strength and muscle hypertrophy gains. So that, based off of their data, I would say is an accurate assumption or conclusion.
To the extent that they showed anything. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And to me, kind of the take-home points of this study, untrained individuals can make significant progress in strength and hypertrophy, regardless of whether or not you're training to failure, provided that you're training in a progressive manner. And again, like the previous study that we talked about, that you're training with a fair amount of effort, right? That you're training with effort. Right. So if you're doing some sort of organized protocol, I don't think it really matters if you're training to failure or not.
Which is the big takeaway. I think this is one of those papers that I think demonstrates the power of skipping over everything else and just going right to the presentation of the data, the figures, because when you do that, you get the whole story. I think the authors are to be commended for presenting individual data, not just the aggregate data, so that we can see not only the central tendencies and spreads for the outcome, but also what happened to each individual subject. Yeah. And when we look at those outcomes, they are all over the place. My personal bias, and you know, I have one like everybody else, is to bite down on the aggregate data, you know, on the central tendencies, the means, which on the hypertrophy and contraction outcomes, the clinically relevant outcomes, seems to favor the not too muscular fatigue group. You know,
I would agree with that. Yeah,
I like that. I'm not a big fan of training to failure.
Sure,
but science doesn't care what I like, and this data is so dispersed that all we can really say is that we don't observe a clinically relevant difference in the study population.
Right.
Similarly, I want it to be really interesting that EMG did not correlate in the study with the strength or the hypertrophy. Right. And so after all, a big article of faith with the high volume muscular failure camp is that reps to volitional failure bring in all those motor units during, you know, and that's what gets you your gains, no matter how much or how little weight you're lifting.
Right.
I always thought it was a little bit screwy, but this data, if you look at the central tendency, does not support that. But it's so widely dispersed that I don't think you can reach any conclusion, except that, again, you can probably get results either way. So pick your poison. The approach that works best with your, you know, personal metaphysics and emotional needs and fetishes and whichever fitness celebrity or guru you worship. You know, again, it's training religion, but the decision can't be scientific because data like this doesn't tell us. The big technical issue here, of course, is the whole crossover effect issue, but I don't think we need to belabor that. You already talked about it because there's no answer. And speaking of bias, like you said, I think it's just hysterical that these authors conclude that training without going to failure, which again is my own favorite approach, could be more appropriate when their own results show that there's absolutely no basis for any such claim. It's just astonishing. Yeah, that was fun too. Anything else to say about that one?
No, I think that we covered that pretty nicely there.
Okay. The next one is yours. It's a short one. And go ahead and tell us about it. That's the Drew.
Yeah, so this is Drew and Finch, the relationship between load, injury, illness, and soreness. And this is a systematic and literature review published in Sports Medicine in 2016. So the aim of this systematic review was to determine training and competition loads and the relationship between injury, illness, and soreness. So they had a total of 35 studies that they included in this review. The majority of them, so to be clear, they're not really talking, when they're talking about load here, they're not talking about resistance training load. They're talking about athletes participating in a variety of sports. Out of the 35 studies, the
work product.
Right, exactly. So they're using load in terms of
volume load.
Overall training volume in terms of their practices and competitions and things like that.
The overall volume intensity product.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
How much they did.
Right. And essentially, variety of sports were included, with the most common being rugby. So 9 of the 35 studies were on rugby players. 5, the next was on cricket. So I don't know how applicable that is to our viewers, but you never know.
I mean, we're all over the world, right?
Yeah,
So
that's right.
the people in Pakistan and India and Great Britain,
Uh-huh.
they're like lining up to watch you,
Yeah.
right? They want to know
Right.
what you had to say about cricket. So be respectful.
Okay.
All right.
And essentially the results highlight that there is emerging moderate evidence, which is the terms that they use in the study, for the relationship between the training load applied to an athlete and the occurrence of injury and illness. Now, the thing that I think they did a good job of pointing out later on, and being a little bit more specific, is that to mitigate the risk of injury, coaches should avoid acute spikes in training load, and that they should monitor. They also get into kind of some of the psychosocial aspects of this stuff, and monitor athletes' perceived level of exertion, both acutely and chronically. So I think the key there is avoiding spikes in training load, more so than anything else. And one of the things that they talk about in the paper is that moderate loads have been shown in some studies to be protective of injury, which I think kind of aligns with our thought process behind getting stronger via strength training.
They spend the whole paper kind of focusing on like, as you increase the load, you're going to get closer to a place where you're at risk of injury, like no kidding. But I thought it was really important. But they buried the lead, which is like,
right.
It can also be protective.
Yes,
and,
that they paid very little attention to throughout the study. And I think from our standpoint, when we're talking about resistance training, I mean, I think that is the point that we would focus on.
Right. So bring it on home real quick. I don't think we need to belabor this one too much. Basically, there's a sort of a vague and fuzzy dose-response relationship, both between volume load and injury, and volume load and resistance to injury, right? So,
yes.
You could, I guess, if you looked at that and you were uninformed, you might think, well, that's a pretty narrow therapeutic window, but this covers so many different sports and everything. I think that's impossible to say. I think you honed in, you zeroed in on the most important thing which is that you just can't suddenly like dump a huge increase in volume load on your athlete. That's how you're going to get them not overtrained for the reasons we talked about, but hurt, which is bad. So anything else on this one?
No, I mean, I think that a lot of the information in there is somewhat vague, and they don't really definitively come out and make a firm statement one way or the other. And I think, like we said, I mean, it's about avoiding these large spikes in the stress that you're applying, if you are applying a load that your athlete's able to recover from, then that should be protective against injury. So I think that those are the two important points.
The whole thing's sort of an implicit manifesto for rational programming, block training, carefully manipulating volume and intensity, and total work volume over time. So it's not without value. I think
I agree.
A good one to have in our database. All right, so next one is a short one. We're going to talk about the Cochrane review by Moore et al. Non-prescription oral analgesics for acute pain, an overview of Cochrane reviews from the Cochrane database 2019. I love this, a Cochrane review of Cochrane reviews. So you can think of it as like a real concentration of truth, or as a copy of a copy of a copy, depending on how cynical or credulous you want to be. But I wanted it in here for a specific reason. I'm going to, again, do this one really quickly, not too much time in the weeds with the methods or anything, because I mostly picked it to underscore something that I've been saying for a long time. It's a see I was right paper. Combination of acetaminophen, which is Tylenol, with an NSAID like aspirin or ibuprofen is powerful and effective and generally well tolerated. especially for short-term episodic use. And figure 1 tells the story. I'm going to go out on a limb, and we're going to include that figure in the final video here, showing the number needed to treat for all sorts of over-the-counter preparations and combinations. And who's number 1? Acetaminophen 1,000 milligrams plus ibuprofen 400. Now, Tylenol plus Motrin or Tylenol plus aspirin is my go-to approach, both as a coach and as a physician. And people just look at you funny, and the online chicken littles and trolls just go out of their fucking minds. And yet here it is in black and white. It's not crazy. It's not going to kill people, and it works like a charm. If you train, and if you're sore or you're hurting and you don't have contraindications to either acetaminophen or an NSAID, what's crazy is to not use this approach, right? So, that's all I'm going to say about that. If you're a coach or a doctor, you should have like a stack of laminated cards of figure 1 to hand out to people. That's the main value of this. What do you think about it?
No, I think it just reinforces exactly what you said. I mean, these are drugs that are readily available, that are cheap, and that are very effective and have minimal risk of side effects. So, I mean, why would you avoid them? Why would you take them? As a physical therapist, this is actually something that I deal with all the time. I have patients post-operatively. They're coming in, they're miserable. They can't go through their exercise programs, and I said, "Well, are you taking anything?" No, I don't want to. I don't want to take anything. I don't want to take anything. And they've refused.
All natural. All natural.
So it's such a battle with people. So like you said, it's right here in black and white, and hopefully we can help get the message out that if you're in acute pain, this is an effective way to manage it.
It really is. All drugs deserve respect. Do these drugs have side effects? Yes, they do, because everything has a side effect. Coffee has a freaking side effect. So, but if you use them as directed, they're safe and effective, and don't be in pain.
Right. Unnecessarily. And I think that you've pointed this out really nicely, is especially with the masters population. If you can help manage that pain and do something productive like train, because you're in part managing that pain effectively, then that's going to lead to greater health outcomes, but more positive benefits.
It's a great reason to be born in the 20th century is access to these medicines. Okay, so I think we've said enough about that one. Next one is it's not a deep dive. It's yours, the Robinson, but it's a good one to have in our database. So go ahead and tell us about it.
So this is Robinson et al. So nutrition and muscle strength as the key component of sarcopenia, an overview of current evidence. And this was published in the journal Nutrients in 2019. So this to me is kind of similar to some of the other ones that we've talked about, kind of like the Overtraining article and things like that, in that it's something that we think is so common sense, right? And think that there must be some clear-cut evidence to support what we think we know about this. And again, here's another area where the literature is just not very good. It's not conclusive to any degree. So the aim of the overview was to evaluate the links between muscle strength, sarcopenia, and nutrition. And the main message from the reviewed studies is that findings are inconsistent and data on muscle strength are often lacking. So that's one of the big things, is that all of these studies that they included, very few of them included any sort of actual resistance training intervention. They're looking at hand grip dynamometers and things like that, which is kind of
God, the hand grip and the freaking ice, like that's the outcome in so much research. And I'm like, really?
Right. Yep. Yeah.
Well, you're able to squeeze it really good. It's like you can open a mayonnaise jar. That's great.
So the author said that many of the articles provided only suggestive evidence of the benefits of higher nutrient intakes and diets of higher quality. So again, kind of, nebulous in terms of what they consider higher quality diets. I mean, we all kind of have an idea about, good foods versus bad foods and things like that. But so gaps in current evidence that need to be addressed. better understanding of individual differences in responsiveness to dietary change, clearer distinction between protective and therapeutic actions of diet, influence of dietary patterns on muscle strength, and that's especially needed to be combined with physical activity protocols or resistance training protocols. So, while it's been our experience in the field that increased total caloric and protein consumption in combination with a resistance training program is going to have a positive impact on the loss of muscle mass that occurs with aging. The current body of literature has kind of yet to catch up to that, right, in regards to their research designs and methodologies.
It certainly trends in that direction, the current body of data. It certainly trends in a direction that corresponds to our experience as coaches. But again, this is just another one of these papers where all this vociferous assertion of like, yeah, you eat this one thing, or if you eat that, you're poisoning yourself. It's all faith-based. It's all faith-based, or it's based on our experience as coaches on the platform working with clients. It's like, yeah, you need to eat your food, you need to get your sleep, and you need to do your training. But anything beyond that, pretty much faith-based. For me, a couple of things in here are take-homes, one of which is the emphasis on the increased protein requirements of older adults. Which goes against what we actually see in the general population. When we look at them, older adults tend to eat less protein,
right?
And maybe even less overall as they get older.
I would say they eat less in general, and certainly eat less protein. Yeah.
Even though their protein requirements are greater to overcome the general anabolic resistance of aging. But for me, the real take home, the real hidden gem in this paper is Figure 1, which I think is awesome. Figure 1 is the European Working Group on Sarcopenia in Older People algorithm for case finding and making a diagnosis and quantifying severity and practice of sarcopenia, right? So this is the diagnostic algorithm or the approach algorithm for sarcopenia. And where does it begin? With strength. Right? So basically what this algorithm says is, you find cases, you assess, you confirm, you look at severity, but it all starts with strength. Basically what this algorithm says is, if you're freaking strong,
you don't have to worry about this.
You don't have to worry about sarcopenia. The workup terminates right there. Oh, yeah, shit, you're a strong fucker, right? We don't need to work you up for sarcopenia. You're strong, right? And so I think that, if you think about that, it kind of opens up a world to you. What it says to me is a good way to prevent sarcopenia, which is devastating. It is a devastating plague in older adults, is to get strong. And if you're not strong, you may very well be sarcopenic, which, on the face of it sounds like, yeah, I don't have a lot of muscle mass. I'm an old guy. I don't have as much muscle as I did when I'm younger. But that doesn't just mean that you're not strong, right? So the idea that the diagnostic approach starts with strength, if you lack strength, you may have sarcopenia, but that's not the end of it. The implications of sarcopenia on the physiology are just as far-reaching as you can imagine. Muscle is a gland. It's the most massive gland in the human body, right? It's the metabolic and functional implications of sarcopenia are absolutely overwhelming. But it begins with strength. It begins with strength. The approach to this disease, the diagnostic approach, begins with strength. And I think that's a real deep point. I was not aware of this particular diagnostic algorithm. It really,
I actually was not either.
It really jumped out at me. So again, a great review. You got to know what you don't know. Not knowing what you don't know is, that's how you do stupid shit. And so it's again, you picked this paper, and I think it was a good choice for our database. So
I thought it would be up your alley, So
absolutely,
I hand selected it for you.
Wonderful, much appreciated. Okay, so let's see what's next. Okay. Oh, I've been looking forward to this one. The Lugaresi. The Lugaresi. Lugaresi et al. Does long-term creatine supplementation impair kidney function in resistance-trained individuals consuming a high-protein diet? Fuckers, right? You know I hate that, right? When the title of a paper is a question. Right?
I actually thought about that when I said I can't believe he picked this one because the title is in the question form.
You're asking me. Yeah. You did the paper, right? I hate that. This is a 2013 Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. The authors make note of the popularity of creatine among strength trainees and bodybuilders and others engaged in high power sports. And they cite multiple papers in this growing body of data that creatine supplementation is not injurious to the healthy kidney. But they say, what about those who are already on a high protein diet? Mm-hmm. So the purpose of this study was to examine the effects of creatine supplementation on kidney function in resistance trained individuals consuming a high protein diet, and critically, to use a gold standard measure of renal function to do so. Mm-hmm. Now, they note correctly that in most of the literature, the investigators simply measure serum creatinine and use the standard clinical derivation formulas for creatinine clearance, mm-hmm. Which is a surrogate for glomerular filtration rate and renal function. But that's not good enough because supplemental creatine can be converted to creatinine, and a high protein diet can be converted to creatinine, which would increase the serum creatinine level and perhaps falsely suggest decreased creatinine clearance and kidney disease, even mm-hmm. though it might be the case that creatinine clearance increases in those subjects. So what did they do? They took resistance-trained bros in their 20s and randomized them into creatine supplementation with creatine monohydrate on a loading protocol of 20 grams per day, followed by 5 grams per day for the 12-week study, or to placebo, which was just dextrose, the classic mm-hmm. sugar pill. They were told to just train and eat the way they always did. Vegetarians, current creatinine users, bros with kidney disease, or bros using steroids were theoretically excluded. They underwent pre and post testing for a variety of measures, the most important of which was the gold standard measure of renal function, the glomerular filtration rate, measured with 51 chromium ethylene diamine tetraacetic acid clearance, which we'll just call 51 chromium clearance. Basically, they injected a radioisotope into the blood and watched how fast it disappeared and used a standard correction formula to derive the clearance. They also looked at how much albumin in particular and protein in general the subjects spilled into their urine, mm-hmm. and at serum and urine electrolytes and serum creatinine. Subjects were pretty similar in terms of their age, body composition, training experience, training frequency, protein intake, and so on. Although there were minor differences, none of them were statistically significant. The placebo group ate a tiny bit less protein during the study, but not to a degree that I would consider relevant. At the end of the 12-week study, there were no significant differences in 51 chromium EDTA clearance, nor in serum creatinine levels, nor in blood urea nitrogen, nor in serum or urine electrolytes. In short, the creatine supplementation had no statistically significant impact on renal function. However, I want to congratulate the authors on presenting the individual data instead of just averages and bars, because that individual data shows a clear trend toward increased clearance in the creatine group. Now, that's not statistically significant, but the trend in the individual data is really clear. So that's mm-hmm. interesting to the extent that it means anything. So overall, these results are reassuring, and they comport entirely with other data in this growing literature. The authors, again, should be congratulated for doing a power analysis, but they had a lot of dropouts. Mm-hmm. They calculated they would need 24 participants for 80% power, okay, but they ended up with 26 total participants, and it wasn't clear to me that their power analysis was for the entire study or for groups, which would be a big deal for a study where you're confirming the null hypothesis, right?
Well, so like you said, they finished with 26. They started with 46.
Right.
So, I mean, that's a really high dropout rate.
Yeah, yeah, right. So what if all the other guys went to dialysis? I don't think so, but still, you know, it's concerning. There mm-hmm. was no regulation of dietary or exercise parameters here. And the dietary data is by self-report, which always raises a red flag.
Right. They had them do a dietary recall of Food Journal for a week or so, right? Pre and post.
That's just weak. This 51 chromium clearance method, it's been a gold standard for a long time. You can find papers going back to the 70s at least. And it's critical that they use this assay. In clinical practice, physicians and researchers doing kind of sloppy work just measure the serum creatinine to approximate the creatinine clearance, the creatinine clearance, just using certain assumptions. And that in turn allows them to approximate the glomerular filtration rate, which in turn is a measure of renal clearance, but only for solutes that are freely filtered and not reabsorbed. So this is a pretty good evaluation of renal function that they did here, especially when combined with the serum and urine measures that were included. The paper is small and short, as usual. The authors wanted to do a 12-month study, but bros just would not cooperate, and they were dropping out like flies. And they had to be happy with 12 weeks, and that's a significant limitation.
It's interesting that they even acknowledged that in the paper, because they really didn't have to say that their intention was to do it for a year. And that they basically shortened it to 12 months just so that they can ensure that they met their power, their power analysis in terms of participants.
So props to them. They designed a pretty good study, and like most pretty good studies, it didn't work out the way they wanted, and they didn't try to sweep anything under the rug. They said, this is what happened, and this is what we got, and that's cool. I think this is more or less applicable to our master's population, athletes of aging, but that is my own bias, a certain assumption, and it's certainly not demonstrated here. This is a different population. The study obviously looked only at those with good renal function and no comorbidities. So I think it's reassuring, and it definitely gives the lie to the internet know-it-alls who pop up every freaking time to tell us how creatine will destroy the kidneys. But there's a lot more work to be done here. For now, I take creatine myself, and I suggest that my clients without kidney disease give it a try. Although in actual practice, I think it helps around the margins, and it's certainly not essential. Again, I think it's reassuring. Well, what do you have to say about this one?
No, I agree. I mean, actually, I think out of all the studies that we looked at for this review, this was probably the most well-designed study in terms of its practical applications, the way that they, specifically were looking at creatine consumption in a group of resistance trained individuals who are already, consuming a high amount of protein. Like you said, the assessments that they used, everything I thought was really well done. And it was a well-written paper. And I think the results are applicable to, like you said, basically, whether we're talking about masters or non-masters, for healthy individuals that are engaging in resistance training, you shouldn't worry about, that creatine is going to have some sort of negative impact on your kidney function if you have healthy kidneys starting out, right? If you do not have kidney disease. So I thought this was a really well done study.
Yeah. I'm glad we included it. So we're going to follow up. The last one is mine. It's a follow up on that by De Souza et Silva, I should say. The Souza et Silva et al. Effects of creatine supplementation on renal function. This is a systematic review and meta-analysis in the Journal of Renal Nutrition. I'm sure most of our viewers subscribe to that. From 2019, so pretty up to date. Pretty well done systematic review and meta-analysis of studies that investigated the effect of creatine on renal function. Most of them using glomerular filtration rate is indicated by creatine clearance, or by looking at urea and other biochemical markers. Review follows the PRISMA guidelines and included randomized trials, observational studies, and case studies. They excluded narrative reviews, animal studies, abstracts, and papers where subjects had pre-existing renal damage. Good. Although that didn't seem to apply to the case studies they looked at, which I thought was weird. They evaluated the randomized control trials for quality using the Pedro scale and other studies with the JBI criteria, so they did their due diligence on looking at study quality. Their search pulled down 509 papers, and after applying exclusion criteria, they got 15 studies encompassing 497 subjects, basically, one small RCT in the medical world. So not great. The data we have available for systematic review and meta-analysis doesn't even match up, to a small RCT for a new drug. So in fact, the meta-analysis they did included only 5 studies encompassing 220 subjects. So viewers can pull the paper and look at the greedy details themselves if they wish. I think this paper was fairly well done and gives us a pretty good picture of where the literature's at.
And I agree.
Where is that? Bottom line, when we look at this body of literature, we find that creatine supplementation does not damage the healthy kidney. This is what you find regardless of how much creatine you supplement or for how long. Doses in these studies range from 5 grams per day to 20 grams per day. Sweet Jesus. And study intervals range from 8 weeks to 132 weeks. Most of the studies use creatine monohydrate, which is great because I think that's the form that should be used. The only indications of renal damage in literature are to be found in case reports, which I remind everybody is the standard format for reporting fantastically rare clinical entities.
That's why they get published.
Right, exactly, yeah. But they totally oh my God, people read those like, this is going to get me. No, it was reported exactly because it was weird, right?
Right. If those case reports had typical results, the same results that we see in these other reviews, then they would never get published. Why would you publish something that's an N of 1 that agrees with everything else in the literature? Man
gets struck by lightning at the mall. Oh my God, right? So, for example, Barisic et al. Reported an adverse effect on renal function in a single subject with a pre-existing nephropathy or renal disease. Again, I'm not sure why the authors of this review even mention it, since pre-existing renal disease was an exclusion criteria for the trials they looked at, and the usefulness of case reports is so low that I think inclusion here was a bit silly. So again, even when you're looking at crude and confounded variable like creatinine clearance as a surrogate for GFR, as in these studies, the literature in aggregate does not reveal at present that there's any adverse effect on the healthy kidney or liver, I might point out, based on the studies here. That's not even bringing in the Lugaresi paper we just discussed, where a gold standard assay of GFR shows no impact on renal function. Paper doesn't assess the performance benefits of creatine, but it does reinforce what we already know. So, the chicken littles who squawk about creatine and the healthy kidney need to find something else to squawk about, which they will. Basically, this is where we're at on creatine. Everybody just needs to calm down. And if it works for you, take it. And if it doesn't work for you, then save your money and don't take it.
Right. But it's a relatively cheap supplement. It's readily available. And, in general, the research on it is good from a performance standpoint, and it's safe. So, it's something that why not take? Why not try it, see if it helps?
Yeah,
right?
I agree. So that's what we got. I think we made pretty good time on that. We did. Just about what we used. So how'd you like it? It's your first journal club? Want a minute?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Yes. Thank you so much for having me on.
You going to come back?
Of course. Only if you want me back. If you'll have me, I'll come back.
No, you're part of the charter team. It's you, Will, CJ, and Bob Tana, and we'll bring other people in too from time to time. But you guys are the core. And as I expected, you just did a stellar job with it, and I really appreciate having you on. So,
I appreciate being a part of it.
It's past both our bedtime, so I think we can sign off and look forward to start thinking about your next stack of papers.
You got it, Sully.
All right, take care and good night.
Have a good night.